So generally, when I get to share, it's usually been about 2 months in between when I get to share, and so this time it's just 1 week. So you guys get that, but it hasn't been long, and so I always do a recap. I'm not going to do a super big recap because it's been 1 week, and the recap honestly is more for me than anybody else. So Jesus is we're in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5. Jesus is giving this statement of the moral standards of the kingdom. This Sermon on the Mount is Jesus kind of talking about the kingdom, his kingdom, to this people gathered on this hillside, Matthew 5. And he's talking about, as we've said before, when he talks about the kingdom, he's talking about something that is to come in the future one day, as well as something that is now and here and can be experienced in this life on this earth. And many of the ideals that Jesus talks about, last week we talked about anger, lust, and divorce. Many of these are only going to be fully realized one day in the coming kingdom when it comes in its full in the future. But Jesus also doesn't then say, okay, so it's one day, so we don't have to worry about it now. We can begin to live out these ideals of the kingdom as people of the kingdom, changed by Jesus here today, now in our midst. And in doing so, it creates little pockets and little fields of the kingdom around us. And so Jesus has also, last week we talked about how he introduced this format of you have heard it said, of days old, in the law, or in some combination of these three things, you've heard it said that this is the case. And then Jesus says, but now today, here, I, that is Jesus, say to you. And so he's setting up this idea that what was once taught or once thought or once believed about the law is still good, but now I'm going to expand on it and maybe even flesh that out a little more. And in doing so, Jesus is claiming some authority about how he interacts with the law. For a person in their time period to do that, you have to be at the very least a prophet sent by God, but more likely something much more than that. And so in doing so, Jesus highlights an authority to give the moral standard of the kingdom. Who better to give this moral standard than king themselves? And so with this in mind, we're going to continue in this same format this week. And if you would turn your Bibles to Matthew 5, we're going to be starting in verse 33. And so far in this section, like I said, Jesus has addressed and expanded on anger, lust, and divorce. And those are pretty meaty topics. And what we're going to find is, we just sang the song Center, and it talks about like putting Jesus at the center of our identity, who we are. So that way, when we interact with the world around us, we interact first and foremost as a person changed by Jesus. And as we talk about payback and promises, we're going to find that in these two areas, that is so crucial, because we're going to find it's very hard to deal with these things, because while very situational, this week has more to do with just how we live and how we view the world around us. And only through Jesus are we able to do that from a kingdom perspective. And so Jesus is going to continue on this pattern of how do people of the kingdom, changed by Jesus, interact with a law that Jesus fulfilled in a way that both says the law is good, but we can do something more than maybe what it just said. And so he continues, Matthew 5, starting in verse 33, Jesus says, again, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. But I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. If anyone would sue you, take your tunic. Let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. Let's pray. Dear Lord, we thank you for your word. We thank you for Jesus and the Sermon on the Mount. I pray that as we look at these two areas of promises and payback, oaths and retaliation, that we would have grace with ourselves, but also have a high view of this kingdom standard that Jesus gave. I pray that the Spirit would move this morning, and that my thoughts and words would get out of the way. Thank you again. Help us have hearts attuned to what you have for us. In your name we pray. Amen. So Jesus continues again in this format of, you have heard that it was said, and now today here I say to you. And he says, you have heard that it was said of those of old in the law and the tradition that you should not swear falsely. And if you're going to swear, you need to perform what you have sworn. And so the common teaching on an oath was that if you're going to swear by something, the understanding was you should not swear by God or God's name, because if you swear by God or God's name, you were expected to do the thing. Like you didn't have an out. If you didn't do it, it was viewed as breaking the law. Specifically, Numbers 30 verse 2 says, if a man vows a vow to the Lord and swears an oath to bind himself by a pledge, he shall not break his word. So if you say you're going to do it, you do it. If you tell, on God's name I will do that, you'd better do it. That's what the law says and what Jesus agrees with. The idea of making a vow or swearing a pledge, though, goes back to the third commandment, where it says you should not take the Lord's name in vain. Because that idea is this one is like, okay, if I swear on God's name or I evoke God in some way to bring God into this situation of me making a promise, a vow or an oath, and I don't do it, I have somehow now associated God and who God is and God's name with my lack of trustworthiness if I do not do it. And so in doing so, they believed and viewed it as if you do that, you are actually like taking God's name in vain in that way. And so if you make a promise, you were expected to follow through, especially if you take the vow before God. But if we're not supposed to take the vow before God, then the question that they had was, how do we get people to believe us? Like, if we want someone to know how serious we are, how much we mean, what do we swear by if we can't swear by God? Like, he's the highest authority in their culture. So now what? How do we get somebody to believe what we say? And it became this tradition that if we can't swear to God or by God or make our vow before God for fear of breaking it, then let's just pick something else. Swear on something else. And it became custom to swear on heaven or the ground we walk on or the temple or the altar or the or even on our own lives. And their culture would say, okay, you can replace God in the oath with something else. And thus, if you don't do it, you're not swearing to God. You're not breaking your oath before God. You're breaking your oath before heaven. Heaven is my witness. I'll be there on Saturday to help you move. I swear on the ground I'm walking, I'll pay you back by the end of the week. I swear on Jerusalem and the temple and on my offering next week that I did not touch that man's donkey. I did not kill that donkey. It's not mine. I didn't do it. I swear on my own life. I'm telling the truth. These are things that were getting thrown around, and they might sound similar to things you hear today. Maybe not the donkey part. But Jesus highlights a number of problems with this. And first, I want to say, what if you end up sick on Saturday and you don't show up? What if you fail to pay the person back? You don't have the money when you thought you would, and you can't pay them back. What if you, in fact, made a mistake and it was not your donkey? What if you don't have all the facts and so you're not telling the truth and you only find out later? You don't know. And that's what Jesus is going to be getting to when he says, you can't even control the color of your hair. And what if, when that happens, when that circumstance comes up and it causes you to possibly have to break your vow, what happens if you do? Are you expected to have to follow through anyway? Or does your promise become null and void now? What does your promise and what you used to get truth into the situation, what does it stand for anymore? How do you view trustworthiness and truth? Because the religious leaders of their time would say, well, you didn't swear on God's name or to God himself, so you're good. You haven't broken the law. Go in peace. You shouldn't do that. You should keep your promise, but you haven't broken the law of God because you didn't swear to God. No harm, no foul. This stands in contrast to what Jesus says, which is just very short and very sweet and to the point. He says, do not take an oath at all. Don't do it. And he gives some reasons. The first, he says, if you swear a promise on heaven or earth or any created thing or the temple or Jerusalem or the altar or yourself or your friends, it reflects on the God who made those things. In their culture and their thinking, God the Creator is a key aspect of the world around them. And so to say something about creation itself is to say something about the God who created it. This does not mean, I can't stress this, that God is heaven or God is earth or God is the temple. But in their culture, they understood you're doing the same thing. They're not dumb. They got it. They knew what they were doing. Rather, this swearing an oath falsely, taking a vow in vain, making a promise and not keeping it, using anything to pad what we say is dishonest and it's manipulative. In the end, it's saying, well, you don't seem to buy what I'm saying, or you don't seem to want to do what I want you to do. So let me tack on a few things in order to see if I can sway you to do what I want, or be where I want you to be, or believe what I have said to you. How do we view truth? Do we view it as a tool that we use? Or do we view it as something much more than that? I want to stress real quick, Jesus is not saying that all promises, like we should never make a commitment ever. When Jesus is giving the Sermon on the Mount, he has just finished talking about marriage, which is like the commitment. So he's not saying never, ever, ever make a commitment. But what he is saying is like, you need to take your commitment seriously. The words you say, how you use your words and how you use truth, you need to take it seriously. Because it's going to affect how people view you. And as he said at the beginning of chapter 5, they will see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. It's going to affect how they view the King of the kingdom. We should not look at truth and try to appeal to it in order to get someone to believe us. That's not the goal. We should conduct ourselves as people of the kingdom, people changed by Jesus. We conduct ourselves so that when someone hears you say, I'll be there Saturday, I'll pay you back, I didn't do that, I'm telling you the truth, you don't need to take an oath. We live in such a way that when people hear what you say, they can believe it. Because of the way you live, because of the way you speak, members of the kingdom can, as Jesus puts it, let what you say be simply yes or no. And in the kingdom, there's no spin on truth. Truth is truth. It's available. It's realized. We don't bend truth to pad our promises. We don't bend truth to get people to believe us. We don't use vows or oaths to get someone to do something. Rather, in the kingdom, believing others and knowing what is true comes naturally because it's evident in our lives. And people changed by Jesus, that's the goal. To live lives when people look at it, it goes, yep, they said they'd be there, and I trust them to be there. They said this, and I trust that they believe that. In the kingdom, you don't need a petty or senseless vow, which you could violate, because in the kingdom, a yes is as good as yes, and a no is as good as no. No spin required. And if you hear that, and you go, that sounds almost too good to be true, it's because our world spins all the time. Truth is this thing that's used to get a response, to make money, And Jesus says, no, no, no. The kingdom has a higher value of truth than that. We don't use it. Truth is not a tool. So about oaths and promises, we could say, the third commandment tells us not to take God's name in vain. And the Torah says when you take a vow before God, you better do it. But Jesus says, don't make a vow at all. Don't do it. Because when you do take one, you're expected to do it. And if you fail to follow through, you're negatively going to affect how others view you and your God and the kingdom. In the kingdom, honesty and truth are of higher value than your image and people believing you. In the kingdom, truth is of higher value than people believing what you say. And the way we get there is by saying, you know what, I've said it, and I'm done padding it. If they want to believe me, they will believe me. People of the kingdom, changed by Jesus, live lives characterized by truthfulness, trustworthiness. No convincing vow or promise needed. This does not mean that you can never say, hey, I'll be there. It's a commitment. Jesus isn't saying that. He's saying we need to live lives that value truth in the things we say. And so from oaths and promises, Jesus moves into retaliation and payback. Verse 38, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And you might hear that, or you might read that, and you might say, did they really think like that this was helpful? Haven't they heard like an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind? This comes from, in the Old Testament, this comes from Exodus 21. And Exodus 21, 22 to 25, specifically this idea of eye for an eye and tooth for tooth is given so that way the people in charge of ensuring that justice happened, they would gather in the gates of the city, and they would have the elders and some of the judges come in, and they would sit, and they would bring these cases before these guys, and they would hear them, and they had this kind of standard, this saying that went around, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And what this was to make sure that those guys who were upholding justice didn't let it get out of hand. In other words, whatever wrong was done to someone, the punishment or the retribution or whatever the end result is needs to be fitting for the thing done. It was never about, okay, well, he poked my eye out, so I would like his eye in return. That does nobody any good. It was originally used to give justice to circumstances where telling the equivalent injury was very difficult. Sometimes things happen and it's like, this doesn't have a monetary value. I don't even know how to tell what justice looks like. And so they had this idea, an eye for an eye and a tooth for tooth, and they would go over the situation. And it's more about we need to make sure that the right thing's done than it is about, I need to get back. Another way to put this notion, the law was not about retaliation. If someone knocked out your tooth, the law did not intend for the person to go punch out the other person's tooth. It's not helpful. That was not the goal. Rather, restitution for the thing done was what was pursued. And the idea is that it is pursued in a way where both parties, the person harmed and the person doing the harming, come to the end result and they go, it's fair, it's good, we agree. There were those, however, that took this and used it as a reason to get back. Okay, he let my sheep out again. I cannot believe it. Somebody get the wire cutters, because tonight we're going to go let his sheep out. We're going to get him back. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. My sheep are out of the pen, so why aren't his? But so often, when we as people humans try to deal with justice and we start talking about trying to get even, if we're really honest with ourselves, if we really look at ourselves in that moment, we're going to find we don't want to get even. We want to get ahead. We want, well, okay, but I just want to be one step above what they did to me. We are very, very, very bad judges of justice, especially when we're in the moment of being harmed. And God knew that, and that's why the law was given regarding to your neighbors to say, you need to bring this before other people so that way they can help you make sure the right thing's done. Jesus says, don't resist the one who is evil. And you might hear that, and you might go, I think I might be getting in for more than I signed up for. And if you ask me, I think many of the people gathered there had the same feeling. I can imagine that Jesus says, yeah, don't resist the one who is evil. And as he starts in on what he says after that, people start to leave the hillside. Because that's hard. It's difficult. This likely refers to the one who intends evil to you. And to many of the people gathered there, remember, these are the outcasts, the people who've had evil done to them. And Jesus says, yeah, don't evil. Don't resist when people mean evil to you. And they might have heard that and gone, tell us more about the kingdom part, because that doesn't sound great to me. Many of them probably had this notion, well, so we've been involved with this kingdom on earth, and it's kind of chewed us up and spit us out. And we didn't really like it. And part of the reason Jesus around is he's talking about this new kingdom. And maybe that kingdom will go and get this other kingdom and make sure that we have justice and that it's repaid and it's all dealt with. And Jesus, in that situation, in that moment on earth, he says, nope, not right now. The kingdom handles wrongdoing differently, and it does not handle it with more wrongdoing. And Jesus gives 3 tangible examples. He says, if someone slaps you on the cheek, if someone sues you for your tunic, or if someone would force you to go a mile. And you hear those, and you think, okay, I don't have a tunic necessarily, and I have a car, so going a mile is just fine. It's okay. But these are real, very specific, on-the-nose examples of what the people that Jesus is talking to on that hillside would have been dealing with. And before looking at these, I want to note one thing. Jesus is not calling for us to be doormats. He's not putting doormat theology, which is, well, you have to just take every single awful thing ever and go seek for more awful things to be done to you in the name of, no, Jesus himself fled violence. Jesus addressed wrongdoing, but it was never in the moment to get retaliation. Jesus is speaking specifically about situational justice in the moment when we are harmed and done wrong. How do we respond in a way that holds justice higher than what we think is fair? That's what he's talking about. And so these 3 examples are realities of the people seated before Jesus. They're not random. Jesus didn't just start talking about people hitting other people. Because in their culture, as Jewish people under the Roman government, it was totally acceptable by the Roman government and happened frequently if you broke some sort of Roman law or if you were unable to pay the tax in some way. I mean, they would just wind up and hit you across the face. And so many of these people seated before Jesus, they've probably been hit. And the last thing you want to hear is, okay, now turn to the other cheek to them. It's incredibly, incredibly, incredibly difficult. It's not easy. Jesus knows this. He's not saying, listen, it's so simple. Just do it. That's not the attitude. Incredibly difficult, but it's worth doing. And the idea is this. When this happens, if this happens, don't give the person attacking you or hitting you a reason to do it again. Because also in their system, if you rose up to stop that Roman guard, that was grounds for them to do it again. So you say, stop it. Turn to them the other cheek. And in doing so, you're going to highlight the injustice of what they have just done to you. It's this idea of love them enough to say, I'm gonna let my notion of what is right now go, and let what you did stand. And there's something that goes on in the hearts of people when they see love as the answer to evil. It highlights how bad the evil looks. And it's like, oh, that was a bad look. It's fine. Go. No, don't worry about the tax. Second, he says, if someone sues you in order to take your tunic. The idea of to take your tunic is important because many of these people seated before Jesus are not wealthy. They're poor people. A tunic and a cloak might be all they have. And so Jesus is specifically saying, if someone is trying to take advantage of you, take you to court in order to get the one thing out of two that you have, Jesus says, give them the other thing as well. Because when you're seated before the judge and the guy's like, I want his tunic, and he's sitting there with, he's got his stuff, and you're like, yeah, here's my cloak. That judge is going to see that and go, why do you want this? Why do you want his tunic? This isn't about the tunic. You're doing something. The act of love in saying, I'm not going to pursue what I believe is right now, highlights the injustice of the other person. Or as my grandfather would say growing up, hunter, kill him with kindness. It's hard. If someone's trying to take advantage of you for their gain, and they're taking legal measures, show those deciding the matters the injustice by saying, to me, this is not about a cloak and a tunic. This is about making sure that justice happens. So if I need to hand this over and that's justice, so be it. And if they're really upholding justice, they'll know it's not. Third, he says, if someone forces you to go a mile, this one, for a lot of us, is like, what? How do you force me to go a mile? I just sit there. But in their culture, if a Roman citizen or a Roman soldier strolls into town, they have their pack and they have all their gear, and they see a Jewish family or an Israelite sitting, they walk over and they drop the bag and they say, pick it up and carry it a mile that way. Do it. And that Israelite citizen, that Jewish person, was expected to pick the bag up and carry it. And Jesus says, carry it 2 miles. And I want to note this. Jesus could have given us this caveat. Unless it's the Sabbath, then you should refuse to because it's the Sabbath. He says, no, pick it up and carry it. Because to Jesus is highlighting the law of love takes precedence over just keeping the little rules of this thing. Love the person who means evil to you actively. It means picking up their bag and taking it 2 miles, helping them get settled into their house. And in doing that, they're going to go, what am I doing? Like, I can carry it. It's fine. Your act of love will highlight the injustice of the person meaning evil to you. This does not mean that justice should never happen. But in the moment when you are wronged, it means setting aside any notion of payback or retaliation that you have to say, I'm going to choose love in this moment and trust that my God will have justice in some way in the future. The idea again is this: the kingdom mandate for loving action takes precedence over situational justice because we are very bad judges of situational justice. And so if we're bad judges of it, do the loving thing instead. As citizens of the kingdom, we ought to seek to go the extra mile, even when we would be justified in not doing that. If somebody plopped the bag down and said, walk a mile, and somebody carried it a mile and then plopped the bag down and said, I'm okay, nobody would look at that and go, oh, that was awful of them. They'd say, okay, wow, more patient than me. Jesus says, go 2 miles. When we're being mistreated in that moment is not the moment to figure out who is right and who is just and what is fair. It's okay to figure those things out, but in that very, very instance is not necessarily the time, and it should often be done by third parties who help you arrive there, because we're bad at determining what is just so often. Or to put it this way, have a view of justice that views it as so valuable that you don't want it to be mistaken for retaliation. Do we have a view of justice as people changed by Jesus, people of the kingdom, that says, I value justice so much that I don't want my payback and retaliation to be mistook for what is just in this moment? Loving action produces a sense of judgment in the one doing evil. And it puts an end to this cycle of harm. It's saying, I'm not going to play the game. I'm not going to continue to harm. Go above and beyond. And so you might hear that and go, okay, well, it's fine. Just meet the requirement. And Jesus says, no. Give to the one who begs. Do not refuse the one who borrows from you. If the person who is begging is borrowing from you, they probably aren't going to pay you back. And Jesus says, it's okay. Love them, knowing that they're probably not going to pay you back. Love those who have wronged you, and love those to whom you owe nothing. It's very, very, very hard to do. And so in regards to payback, we could say the Torah said an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And that was said to prohibit injustice. But Jesus says when someone does something evil to you, love them. Seek to go above and beyond the evil that they intended towards you. Because we have to admit that we're often poor judges of what is just, and should favor loving action in response. Justice is important, and it is too important for it to be mistaken for retaliation or getting back or getting ahead or taking advantage ourselves. And so in the kingdom, loving action deals with mistaking them. In the kingdom, truth is valued enough to let your words and actions be what they are, rather than padding to get people to believe you. And we look forward to a day where what is true, and there's no spin, and there's no manipulation, and we can begin to live out that future standard of the kingdom now, here today, as people changed by Jesus in order to create a little bit of the kingdom around us. And we look forward to nobody does anything evil to us. That sounds great. But the reality is we live in a world where it's going to happen. And so we can begin to create this little pocket of that kingdom by how we respond to the evil around us here today, and in doing so, create a little bit of the kingdom around us. In the kingdom, truth and justice are fully realized. And it seems the way we begin to promote truth and live out justice, the way we can do that is to show love. Is giving up what we have desires to in those areas and say, I'm just going to choose to love this person regardless. Let go of our personal desires for being believed and getting back. That's difficult. One day, truth and justice will be fully realized in the kingdom. As we interact with it now, it is affected by sin. It's the reality of the world. There is sin. And sin makes us poor decision makers of truth and justice. And so we do better to prioritize love. Put it forward as love. And when we fail to prioritize that love, and we will fail, Jesus knows that. When we fail, we have a Savior who fully embodies this idea of love and truth and justice. So much so that he didn't argue with God about what was right. He said, no, okay, I will die for them. And it's that Jesus that we remember when we take communion. We remember the life Jesus lived, the way he walked and taught with people and the things he did and the people he changed. And we also remember that he died a death on our behalf to pay a price we could not, fulfilling something that we could not. And it's that we remember when we take communion. Here at Eastside, we take what's called open communion, which means you don't have to be a member of our church in order to take it, but you do need to have put your faith in Jesus.